From a waitress who encounters a mysterious man on her late-night shift, to a story of an abandoned road that is deserted for reasons a young man just had to find out, this video has some truly horrifying stories. As always, a huge thank you to the writers, whose links can be found in the description. If you'd like to have your story featured on the channel, feel free to send it to rylhstories@gmail.com. Likes and comments are always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. My first job, which I worked the occasional 9 to 5, was being an accountant for a small law firm in the center of town. Now, I don't make much money during my day job, but it helped put food on the table and did pay for rent for the small one-bedroom apartment I've lived in for about a year now. It was cute, honestly, and to be honest, I didn't plan on moving out of here for a long time. Now, as I put the last of my picture frames into the moving box, I wish my plan had worked out. After working at the firm, my night job as a waitress began at 7:30 at the small drive-in on the outskirts of town. It was a quaint and small, but clean modern-style restaurant that I had actually enjoyed working at. The regulars knew my name by heart, as I seemed to be pretty likable, and of course, after working there for what seemed like forever, I could finally say the usual Mac, or whatever the name happened to be of the customer that had walked in to sit at the island in the center. I knew almost everybody that came in, and the better I knew the person, the better they tipped. As I said, my waitress job began at 7:30 and ended at midnight. Not a long shift, and definitely not as long as some of the other waitresses that worked there. But the owner, Jim, loved me, so I got to stay. I made decent money on tips too, and with Jim being a pretty good guy, he let me keep every penny of it. Most of it just went into the savings, so I kept the job. I needed some money to get around, you know? Like I said, my night started out pretty normal. I got done at the firm and headed back to my apartment for an hour or so of free time before I headed over to the restaurant. I normally just played games on my phone, browsed social media, or watched a show that was on TV or something. But tonight, I was in the mood for a nap. I couldn't sleep, however, and as soon as my head hit the pillow, I realized that something was itching at me. Something distant, and it wasn't the good kind of feeling where you've forgotten that you were supposed to cash your check or you've got another slice of pizza in the fridge. I felt very certain of myself as I pulled my comforter up to my chin and stared at my ceiling. I could hear the familiar sound of a dog barking in the distance, and the occasional thump of footsteps above me as the sweet old lady that lived there was getting ready for her walk. Something's going to happen to me tonight, I thought to myself. I should probably call into work. But as 7 began to near closer, I found myself getting ready for work earlier than normal. As soon as 7 hit, directly on the dot, I was pulling out my designated parking spot and driving off in my old beat-up Chevy. My unusual hour of free time seemed to fade off into nothing as my shift went on. Normal customers came in at their regular time, but tonight the restaurant was empty by 10:30. At 11, no one had come in. At 11:45, Jim and I began to clean up. He had sent the other waitress home, and it was dead, and it didn't seem like it would liven up anytime soon. However, 5 minutes to closing, a man came in. The guy was dressed in all black, a dark hat covering his features. His hood was over his hat and pulled tightly, so I couldn't see them if I tried. I only knew he was a man because when he ordered his coffee with 2 creams and a sugar, his voice was husky and deep. I wish I could put my finger on where I thought I recognized it from, but I gave up after I set his cup in front of him. Jim gave me a weary look and walked to the back toward the kitchen, and I shrugged after flipping the sign from "Come in, we're open" to "Sorry, we're closed." "Closing?" the man asked after a stunned bit of silence. I was taken aback by his comment, and to be honest, he actually startled me. "Oh, yeah. Sorry, no rush, sir," I told him, cleaning up behind the counter. I was already done with that area, and I've seemed to scrub it 5 times while waiting for the man to get out of here and off to wherever he was going. He took about 10 more minutes, just casually sipping his coffee. He didn't do anything else besides that. He wasn't talkative, nor did he even bother picking up the paper from today that sat beside him on the counter. Due to this, I picked it up and threw it in the recycling bin. I didn't care much for the news. I'm sure at least everyone has responded to a waitress when she says, "Have a good night." Your normal response is probably, "Thanks, you too," or "You as well," and so on. So when the man plopped $1 on the counter, I expected this answer when I told him what I tell every customer before they leave. "Have a good night, sir," I told him, taking his dollar and the now empty cup from the spot where he placed them. Before turning to set the cup on the counter of the window, where food is placed to be taken to hungry customers, I expected it to be grabbed and then washed. As I knew Jim went into the kitchen shortly after the man entered, it just sat there, still. "Thanks, lady. I will. I know you won't." I stopped, turning to the man. He was now looking at me, his eyes meeting mine. Oh God, his eyes. They weren't even eyes. They were just empty sockets of dried blood perfectly gorged into holes. Like someone took a melon baller and scooped out his eyes. And his smile, it was cut from ear to ear. It horrified me, and I gasped. Backing into the soda machine as he stood, he didn't say another word. As he walked out and disappeared into the dark, I noticed it was raining. A heavy drizzle of water careened down the glass of the doors. "Jim?" I yelled, speed walking into the kitchen to relay what the fuck I just saw to him. However, the heavy pool of blood on the floor with Jim's lifeless body next to it indicated that he wouldn't be listening to my story. I screamed, covering my mouth in fear. I knocked over a stack of napkins, sending them fluttering onto the floor. Some dropped into the puddle, quickly soaking up the liquid. What the hell would I do? What the hell would I tell the cops? I didn't see anyone enter besides the man. Besides, they wouldn't believe me anyway. So I left. I hopped in my Chevy and fucking left. I know I shouldn't have, and the cops would consider me a prime suspect, as I was one of the only ones working that night. The security tapes weren't even in my favor, because for some reason, I figured they would have already been tampered with. Hell, with this much precision, whoever or whatever killed Jim didn't even let himself known. I didn't even hear his body hit the floor. The drive home was a nightmare. I almost got into an accident with the rain coming down as hard as it was. I kept cursing myself as, out of the corner of my eye, I swore I saw the man that entered earlier walking along the road every time I passed the streetlights. Him always facing the way I was going. I always swerved to avoid hitting something that didn't seem to be there. I slid into my parking space, running into my apartment. I walked as calmly as I could coming into the dark complex. The light across the hall from my apartment was on, but I didn't see any movement as I subtly looked into the window. I knew I was going insane as I unlocked my door. Actually, it was already unlocked. Someone had either broken in, or I stupidly forgot to lock it after my creepy hour of free time this afternoon. Given the circumstances, I walked in. Everything was in place. The door to my single bedroom was closed, but I didn't remember closing it. Still, I thought I was going insane, as I swore I heard something coming from my room, like someone shuffling around, looking for stray pieces of jewelry or a stack of cash. I slightly cracked the door as I peered inside of it. The smaller TV I had hooked up in my room was on, but the only thing it was turned to was a channel that was all static. In the center of my bed was a note that said, Leave here or be forced to. So here I am, furiously packing my stuff up in boxes I kept after I first moved in here. It's nearly 3 in the morning now, and I swear I keep hearing knocks at my window that leads into the hall. Furious footsteps keep pacing above me, and somehow, I know it's not that sweet old lady. I leave in the morning. If anyone has any suggestions on where the fuck I should go, please help me. And if you work at a restaurant and you see some man walk in late at night, dressed in all black, just leave. Please, it's for your own good. If you see me on the news, just keep it to yourself. Like I said, I don't keep up with it. I live in a very rural, hilly area, which has seemingly endless miles of back roads that you can use to travel just about anywhere. In fact, there's a fairly high crime rate here, simply because criminals use these roads to sneak around any police presence, a practice that's almost impossible to stop, given the labyrinth or trails that is impossible to patrol. The farther you travel off the beaten path, so to speak, the fewer signs of civilization you will encounter. Still, most of the locals are very familiar with each other from their time spent out in town, during their shopping or other errands. None of us are intimidated by the prospect of exploring some path we'd never gone down before, as years of experience have given us a pretty good sense of direction that can save us even if we get lost. There is one exception to that rule, however. About 10 miles from my house, there's an unnamed road that heads into a heavily wooded area. Why this road doesn't have a name, I'm not sure, but it is an unspoken rule among the locals that no one, and I mean no one, is to drive down it. Ever. When I was a teenager first learning to drive, my parents warned me sternly about going out into parts that were less traveled. I knew of course what they were referring to. That's because as long as I could remember, they refused to even go close to that place. I listened to them despite my rebellious phase, which coincided with receiving my driver's license, and for years, I actually gave the stories very little thought. That was until I turned 25, and had a house not too far from where I had grown up. One late afternoon after dinner, I was pretty bored, and was looking for something exciting to do. That's when the idea of exploring that forbidden trail came to mind. Youthful energy meant I did not hesitate. I jumped in my car, checked how much gas I had, half a tank, which should have been more than enough, and backed out of my driveway. For some reason, perhaps due to my college education which taught me to use reason over superstition, I felt no fear when the stories from my childhood came back to my mind. It took me about 30 minutes of driving to reach the area where I had been told the nameless road existed. The last 10 minutes of the drive I actually saw no houses, or any other signs of civilization as far as I could tell. I took 2 wrong turns before I came upon a pothole-covered, paved road that branched off slightly to my left. The forest around the entrance was quite thick, and cast a shadow down the path as far as I could see. A thin, rusted chain hung limp across the path, which wasn't even fastened in place. I got out of my car and pulled it aside. Just as I was about to open my door and climb back in, I stopped in my tracks. The forest around me was silent, but that wasn't what gave me pause. Looking down the road in front of me, I thought I heard something. At first it was difficult to make out what it was, but as the sound made its way up the path and closer to me, I realized it was a gasp. A gasp as if nature itself were reacting in horror to something unseen. It seemed to come not from one place, but from the trees far down the road. I stood listening for a moment, wondering what on earth that could have been. Finally, I just shrugged it off as the wind doing weird things, got back in my car, and started forward. By this time it was 6 p.m., which it wouldn't get dark until about 9, so there should have been plenty of light to see where I was going, but the farther down the path I drove, the darker the shadow became, and the trees became ever denser. 5 minutes went by, and then 10. I finally had to turn on my headlights because of the dense blackness that surrounded my car. A few more minutes and the sky, from what I could see of it, was utterly dark. The only source of light was coming from the front of my car. All of this was incredibly odd, but I, of course, chalked it up to a thunderstorm rolling in. What I encountered next finally made me realize that perhaps I should call off my drive. The headlights illuminated trees on both sides of the road, but gradually something began to change. The trees looked different. At first, it was as if the bark around their trunks had been stripped bare. Eventually, they began to take on a sickly purple hue. Leaves became scarcer. Trunks became thinner. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen or heard of. Quite unnerved, I decided to look for a place to turn my car around. After a couple more minutes, I found a small clearing off to the right side of the road, just big enough to fit my car. I slowly pulled off the road and was in the middle of a U-turn when suddenly there was a thud and scraping sound, which made my car jerk to the side. I stepped out into the darkness, using my phone's light to see. Checking underneath the car, I found that it had bottomed out on a large stump, which was keeping the front passenger wheel from touching the ground. The exhaust pipe was also torn loose and dragging the ground. I cursed under my breath and moved around to the back to try to push the car off. No luck. It wouldn't budge. I checked my phone to see that, of course, there was no signal. Figuring I had no choice but to abandon my car, I looked back down the road the way I had come, and then on down the path in front of me. It would take several hours to walk all the way back to civilization, or I could chance it and continue onward, hoping to find a house or that maybe the road would connect to a highway in a couple miles. I decided to take a risk and keep going on foot. I stuck to the side of the road, using my light as little as possible while my eyes adjusted to the darkness. The only sounds were the creaks of tree branches shifting in the wind. I did not see or hear any signs of people or animals. I made it a mile without incident, but when I passed around a bend in the road, I saw something which could be described as the beginning of this nightmare. I noticed movement about 100 feet in front of me. I stopped and tried to be quiet, as I figured out what exactly it was. In the darkness, a figure was shuffling across the road. It appeared hunched over, deformed. I don't know how to describe it. It was dragging something behind it. It made the sound you would think flesh being dragged across pavement would make. I had to stifle a gasp of horror, but quickly crouched down and moved behind a tree as quietly as possible. I peeked around to watch the figure cross the road and drag whatever it was into the trees and down a hill, disappearing out of sight. What on earth is going on here? I thought to myself. I crept forward and peered over the hill, where the thing had gone. All I could see was darkness, but I heard shuffling moving farther into the woods, about 30 yards away. That was enough for me. It was much too late to back, so I hurried on down the road, jogging on my tiptoes to make as little noise as possible. I was looking frantically for a house, anything, any sign of help that could help me get out of this place. The road became rougher, with cracks and potholes indicating it hadn't been maintained in a very long time. The darkness grew deeper, to the point where I was forced to turn my flashlight on the lowest setting, just to be able to see in front of me. The wind picked up, which began to make the trees sway and creak all around. Above these sounds, I began to hear something coming from the sloped forest, running up to my right. It was eerie, hushed moaning, something like the undead would make. It seemed a great host of things were wandering through the woods, given how many distinct guttural voices I heard. The creeping horror turned my blood to ice. In a terror, I shielded my light in my palm to keep it as hidden as possible from whatever was lurking out there in the darkness. To my great relief, it seemed these things weren't coming any closer to the road. I managed to force my terror-stricken body forward another 100 feet. It was becoming difficult to breathe, so I had to devote much of what self-control remained to it. I reached the points where I seemed to be directly downhill from the moans. That's when I heard the gasp. Only 15 feet away, I heard something take a sudden, deep breath, as if it were struggling for air. I instinctively whirled toward the noise and shined my lights. That was a very big mistake. There was a human body laying on the ground, partially covered in dirt and twigs, and in a state of decomposition. The skin was a dark green hue and rotted flesh was missing in places. Even laying there, I could see the chest was moving up and down. My body completely froze in horror, and all I could do was stare. After another wheeze which exhaled a few bits of dirt, the thing must have noticed the light shining on it. It moved its dead eyes to gaze at me, then slowly turned over and tried to push itself upright. I ran down the road and lost all sense of reason in the process. All I could think about was getting away. I heard the thing stumble out of the trees and start dragging itself toward me. I'm not sure how much farther I made it before I collapsed from exhaustion. I curled up in a scraggly bush a few feet into the trees and tried to catch my breath. I couldn't hear anything besides my own breathing and my heart throbbing in my ears. I lay there for what must have been 30 minutes. I'll be honest, at this point I was certain the end was at hand for me. Still, the only thing I refused to do was accept my fate. So I clambered out of the brush and back onto the road, and braced myself for what would probably be my last push forward. I was determined to see what was at the end of this road before I died. The darkness had become so thick that it seemed to physically restrain me. I had to throw my arms in front of me and pull myself forward in order to move at a normal pace. It seemed to almost be water-like. I'm not sure how to describe it. It made my light at its brightest seem very dim. I struggled forward, my body near exhaustion. The dark around me seemed hungry, as if a predator stalking its prey. I knew I had to keep going or something unspeakable would happen to me. Farther and farther into the abyss I struggled. My body neared its breaking points. If some other horror emerged from the blackness, I would not have the strength to flee or fight. Just as my muscles began to shut down, I found my salvation. My light revealed an old gray sedan parked on the side of the road, facing away from me. The paint was faded and chipped, and a thin layer of twigs and dirt covered it. Using the last of my adrenaline, I rushed around to the driver's side and tried the handle. Unlocked. I flung the door open but fell backward when I discovered, sitting in the front seats, two decomposed bodies slumped onto the steering wheel and dashboard. All that remained were bones, bits of leathery, rotted flesh holding them together, and rotted clothes. I climbed to my feet and without hesitation flung the remains of the driver out of the car and jumped in. To my great relief, the keys were still in the ignition, and after a couple attempts, I managed to turn the engine over and get it started. I gained new life in that moment, and hurriedly fumbled to turn on the headlights and shift into gear. That excitement, however, was short-lived, as it was then I encountered the greatest horror of my nightmare. From the blackness surrounding the headlights on the car, a figure emerged. Tall and gaunt, with pale skin and shriveled flesh. Its eyes were dark pits. As it moved toward the front of the car, it began to open its mouth, the lips curled up to right below its eyes, and to the tip of its chin, forming the most inhuman expression I could imagine. It shrieked a terrifying wail and lunged forward, its scrawny legs barely able to support its weight as it ran. I snapped out of my trance and slammed the gas pedal to the floor, cutting the steering wheel sharply. The back wheels lost traction as I spun the car around, got it stabilized, and screeched away. My focus was completely on the road as I tore out of that place. I hardly noticed anything going on outside the car, save a couple moments where I saw dark, indiscernible figures lurking in the trees. It took me 10 minutes to pass where my car was stuck. I wasn't going to stop or come back for it. 20 more minutes and I came upon the first tree that actually had bark and leaves. I could see the pale glimmer of what remained of the sunsets beyond the hills. When I reached the entrance of the nameless road, the chain had been placed back up across it. I plowed straight through, which snapped the chain and crushed the front panel of the car, but I couldn't have cared less. When I finally got home, I rushed inside, threw some essentials into a bag, and drove my other car to a friend's home 2 hours away, leaving my escape vehicle and the skeletal remains of the passenger behind. I have no plans to go home. I'll let the bank foreclose on my property. I don't care. After a couple weeks of crashing on my buddy's couch, I'm flying out to the other side of the country to look for work, and to try to forget everything that happened. I'm going to start a brand new life, with brand new memories. I have to, for my sanity's sake. I'm writing this down as a warning to anyone who is thinking about exploring rural areas. My demand is pretty simple. Don't do it. Go to the beach or a tourist trap. Some place that has people and civilization. The deeper, more mysterious parts of the world may be intriguing, but are perfect places for evil to rest its head. It was my 18th birthday and perfect timing to spread my wings by crossing state lines and camping. My boyfriend, Rob, and I had looked up places to go online. Distance wasn't much of an issue, as long as we were somewhere we could swim, with bathrooms, and could see the stars. These requirements led us to Cove Creek, a campsite about 5.5 hours south from us. After last-ditch efforts to book our flaky friends, we decided to go on our own and paid for a site right by the lake. We shuffled through our best songs to scream to, and an hour to nap through while Rob drove my old Silverado farther and farther away from the city, and into darkness only with speckles of stars and the occasional street lamp. As we neared closer, my phone's signal got worse, and we stayed on the windy road attempting to make sense of the rest of the directions that had loaded. Wildfires illuminated the trees that hovered over us, and the road turned into a little stone bridge, leading to an even more constricting pathway deep into the woods. The dingy rotten sign had Cove Creek written in crackled white paint, and we slowly turned into the campsite through the rusted metal gates. Confused, we looked for a building to check in and get information. We gave up quickly and decided to find our site and stretch our legs with a mini expedition of the area. As we drove around the grounds, we noticed that all of the other 30+ sites were empty. Not completely unusual for a Thursday, but literally all of them in August by a lake was a little off-putting. We found our site and pulled in, relieved to finally see other campers in the site next to us. As I started to unload and set our tent up, we asked them if there was a place to check in, and they explained that there was an RV up the trail. We trekked up to the RV and my boyfriend cautiously knocked on the door, hoping the other campers were right as there was no sign. There was a hushed conversation on the other side of the door, until suddenly the flimsy door opened. A late middle-aged woman that looked as if she hadn't slept for years stood on the other side of the threshold. "Can I help you?" she questioned, without interest. Yeah, my girlfriend and I are camping here for a couple nights, and we were wondering if we had to check in or anything," Rob replied. 22 a night," a gruff voice with a twang stated from behind the woman. "Oh, there seems to be a misunderstanding. We made reservations online," he explained, attempting to peek behind the woman staring at him, glazed over. "We don't take reservations," the man snapped. After a small sigh, we agreed to pay for 2 nights because we had drove all the way, and it was getting late. Rob begrudgingly pulled out his card and started to hand it to the woman. "We don't take card either," he stated bluntly. "Well, I don't have any cash," Rob replied. "There's an ATM in town," he added as the woman shut the door. We exchanged glances and headed back to the tent and car, confused as to where our first $40 went. Rob offered to drive into town while I stayed with our already unloaded stuff. After a quick kiss, he was off, and I was alone. The people in the campsite over said they were going to be leaving tonight and paid for tomorrow, so we could just use their campsite. I thanked them and almost asked why, but didn't, as I thought it was most likely personal. I was sitting on the picnic bench reading when I felt an uneasy sensation, one that makes your spine shiver, the hairs on your arms stand up, and the need to look behind you urgent. As I whipped around, for the first time, I saw the man. He was a little older than the woman, if I had to guess, with salt and pepper hair and wrinkles outlining the scowl on his face. He didn't break eye contact, as I continued to watch him watch me. After that, I went to our tent and left a small hole to peek out of while I waited for Rob's return. Shockingly, my phone chimed. Rob had texted me, "Are you alright?" I replied saying yes and asking him why he texted me that seemingly out of nowhere. "I just got a weird feeling. Be back soon." Eventually, he returned to the site, having already paid the strange owners. We tucked the experience away into the back of our minds and set off for the lake. The campsite itself was beautiful and filled with wildlife. I honestly wish I took more pictures. There was wildlife everywhere, and the sun set right over the mountains as we pulled up chairs close to the lake. We stayed at the lake for about 30 minutes after dusk, and watched the strange flicker of lights over the horizon, and heard laughing voices carry over the lake. Because of the wildfires, there was a burn ban, and we couldn't have a campfire. Without the fire, there was no reason to continuously get attacked by the mosquitoes, so we retreated to our tent. Sitting in the tent, we couldn't help but notice the complete silence, encapsulating our tent. Now I understand it obviously wouldn't be like the city at night, but we couldn't hear the close-by water or animals or anything. It was dead silent. Unnerved, we agreed to sleep early so the reassurance of daylight would come faster. I drifted in and out of sleep for a while. When I woke up for the millionth time, I felt a strange sense of unease wash over me again, as my eyes drifted to the mesh part of the tent that was uncovered by the top. For the first time in hours, I heard a noise that wasn't Rob or me. The crackle of a branch being stepped on right outside our tent by the mesh window. Tears welled in my eyes as I looked for the hardest hitting object I could find. "Are you alright?" Rob inquired quietly. "Yeah, I can't sleep, and I thought I heard something." "I can't sleep either." We stared at each other for a moment. I told him about the weird old man's drive-by, and he told me about the meth addicts he saw in town doing deals. Would it be crazy if we left right now? I felt a pang of guilt. You spent like $80 for us to come here for my birthday. I'd rather cut my losses and sleep in our own bed tonight, living to tell the tale. A long-awaited smile returned to my face, and we quickly and quietly started to pack the truck up. As I did one last glance over the empty, silent campsite, for any dropped belongings, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the shadows just beyond where our tent was. I didn't stay to find out, and hopped in the truck. Roaring to life, the truck tore through the site as we tried our damnedest to be stealthy. Circling through the maze of empty lots, we passed the RV. The woman stood outside and turned her body to watch us pass. As we approached the entrance and only exit, we realized the gates were shut. The truck slowed as we thought about what to do next. Should I go see if I can open it? I gave Rob a crazy look. "Are you nuts? You want to go out there?" With Crazy standing back there? I mean, what are we going to do? Go back? Just as I was about to respond, there was a slam on my window. I screamed bloody murder and was eye to eye with the man. His features were much more clear, and he had wild eyes and yellowing skin to match his teeth. Where are you going? You have reservations. He sneered. Rob floored it through the gates. The chains busted easily, leaving behind the sounds of scraping metal and a lone RV. Our nerves started to calm as we got to the other side of the lake, and continued to drive 20 miles over the speed limits. I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of laughter echoing over the ever-still and silent water.